Welcome, everyone. I'm Pamela Metz. I'm the Director of Chapter Development here at the Scholar Strategy Network, where I work with our 36 state and local chapters across the United States. If Madonna has a minute, perhaps she could drop the link in the chat. If you're interested in connecting with your chapter, or if you're interested in starting a chapter in your area, please reach out to me. I'd love to chat and hear more about it, about your interests. My email is simply pam@scholars.org. Today, I'm delighted to welcome you to the first in Georgia SSN's new four-part series on defending U.S. democracy. The Georgia chapter is led by Michael Evans of Georgia State University and Bernard Tamas of Valdosta State University. If you'd just like to wave and introduce yourself. Yes, thank you. So let me just quickly outline our plan for today. Bernard Tamas will say a bit more about the series and introduce today's speaker, Jennifer McCoy of Georgia State University. Jennifer will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion for the remaining 30 minutes or so. So now I'm going to turn it over to Bernard Tamas to talk a little more about this.
All right. Well, thank you, Pam, and thank you to the SSN national team for helping us host this webinar today. And on behalf of the Georgia chapter of SSN, I want to thank everyone for putting aside the time in your busy schedule for joining us. This is the very first of a webinar series that we plan to continue for a while, but for this year, we're doing four webinars, and this ongoing series will be a discussion on how to develop strategies for battling the current threats to U.S. democracy. So our goal is to showcase speakers who are experts in particular aspects of the crisis we're facing and who can speak about it at a level where we can understand it better as scholars and practitioners. And so we are also planning to post these recordings and we want to make them public afterwards. So for those who cannot make it or who become interested later or want to go back to it, can. We think that there's no one better to begin this series than Professor Jennifer McCoy, and no better topic than the one she's chosen. Dr. McCoy is the Regent's Professor of Political Science at Georgia State University. She is also a non-residential scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as a research affiliate at the Central European University's Democracy Institute in Budapest. She has published extensively about democratic erosion and was a developer of the concept of pernicious polarization. One of her current book projects with Moore Somar is Depolarized Politics and Remake Democracy, which is under contract with Princeton University Press. She was also one of the founders of the Georgia chapter of the Scholar Strategy Network and continues to play an active leadership role. So when my co-chapter leader, Mike Evans, and I began developing this seminar series, there wasn't even a discussion about whether or not we should ask Jennifer to be the keynote speaker. Thankfully, she graciously accepted. Her talk will focus on why it is so hard to build a movement to defend democracy. So let me hand it then over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bernie and Mike, for inviting me. I've been a longtime SSN member, so am really happy to participate in this and to see all of you here. I will start by sharing my screen. So I want to talk about why is it so hard to build a movement to defend democracy. People have been asking in the U.S., what's going on? Why is it so hard to create a resistance, or why aren't there more protests? Asking all sorts of questions like that. And I want to draw on some of the research that I have done with co-authors, with many collaborators, and also that others have done that I will draw on to try and answer this question in a broad fashion. What I plan to do is 3 parts in this talk: lessons from comparative experiences, what are the conditions that are unique to the United States besides sharing these broad common lessons, what else do we need to consider about the United States to answer the question? And I also want to answer on what to do. What can we do about it? So I'll start with research that I have been doing with my co-author, Murat Somer. and to develop this concept of regime uncertainty. And this is the idea that in a context of democratic backsliding, that is a slow, a gradual, a piecemeal erosion of the quality of democracy, of elements of democracy, of liberal democracy, that makes it difficult to know in the moment where it is going and what the system is becoming, the system or the regime. And this is a question that people ask, okay, this government was elected with a majority, so is it just, applying its policy priorities as it has the right to do since it won the election? Or is it actually posing a threat to the entire political system, the democratic regime, the liberal democratic regime? And that leads us to begin asking questions. Are we actually in normal politics where we're just pursuing, participating in elections as normal? Or are we in extraordinary politics where we are facing an imminent threat to the democratic nature of the regime? And what we've seen is that this leads societies to kind of divide into three different groups, depending on how they interpret the context at the moment. And they get into a debate over how to respond. And we call these the cautioners, the alarmists, and the strategic alarmists. Now, the cautioners are more in the normal category, saying that we're in a normal context, there's no imminent regime threat. We're basically going to continue as normal, employing a variety of institutional democratic, mechanisms of politics. So that would be in the top left cell here in this table. Now, strategic alarmists are those who see that there is a threat to the regime. That's how they interpret the context, that there is an imminent threat. But they are strategic in thinking, okay, how should we respond? If we respond in an extreme manner, we may actually lose credibility. We may lose our own legitimacy, particularly if we're seen as using methods that are not democratic themselves. And the alarmists are the group that say, this is so imminent, we've got to use every possible tool, even these down at the bottom that we call extra institutional. And you can see that in an extraordinary context, the bottom right cell, these would be considered probably unconstitutional, perhaps undemocratic kinds of measures, like a coup, like a military coup or some other kind of coup. A general strike that may have no basis in law, civil disobedience, even that may turn violent, and armed resistance. Whereas the institutional kinds of measures up in the top right hand, strategic alarmists and alarmists both might consider those. So these would be unusual in a normal democratic context. So an impeachment is completely institutional, it's legal, it's constitutional, but it's unusual, it's extraordinary. And I want to go down to the bottom, in the middle, cross-ideological anti-incumbent electoral alliances in particular. So it's when political parties across a range of ideologies will form a broad coalition to try to contest an election against the incumbent. Constitutional hardball, an example today would be, okay, should the Democrats be responding to the midterm redistricting effort that's being carried out? That's not considered, kind of kosher. It's extraordinary measure. And, and the Democratic states that are pursuing it, particularly California, had said they were rising above the tide and had implemented an independent redistricting, nonpartisan redistricting commission. So should they break that and try to, fight fire with fire in order to prevent a power grab there? So that's the first lesson from abroad. The second is about the problem of collective action. And this is simply a contrast between a democratic backsliding government that's in power who is, considered to be moving in an authoritarian or using authoritarian or anti-democratic methods. All they need to do is divide and conquer their opponents, or they can intimidate many groups in society into compliance. So preemptive compliance. And we've been hearing about, people referring to that in the United States a lot. Whereas the opposition, and broadly, just the political party opposition, and broadly the democratic, including civil society, et cetera, need to build these broad, kind of cumbersome coalitions, especially if they're going across different interests, different sectoral interests, and different ideologies, in order to halt a democratic slide. And so the collective action problem of democracy movements involves a number of things, and that is when they are trying to mobilize and build this broad coalition, individual interest and even personal safety come to be, or organizational safety, come to be of paramount importance. And they may outweigh the willingness to take a risk for a collective interest. And you can see that in very repressive governments where going out to protest can actually be, quite a risk to your own life and physical integrity. But this leads to coordination problems. So we can have problems within sectors where the sector, whether it's corporate sector, law firms, et cetera, you have competition among them, and so it's hard to coordinate. You can have coordination problems between sectors if they just simply have lack of contact and communication. You have the risks of publicly trying to coordinate, blasting out on social media, being identified as a democracy advocate and an organizer and an activist. And then you have in some countries, repression of communication channels so that you can't even use social media or other means of communicating. They are censored. And so simply a coordination problem of how do you get out the information. A third general finding that we found is the extent, the level, or the degree of democratic erosion really matters on what are the options for a pro-democracy movement to protect democracy. We know that the more closed the civic and information space is, it becomes much harder to mobilize and to coordinate. And this is true for elections when a government like Hungary controls 80% of the media. It's very hard for the opposition to get out their electoral messages, all the way to the censorship, as I mentioned before, of organizing a protest or an action. And so the greater the degree of the democratic erosion, the harder to mobilize and coordinate in opposition, and the easier for the government to divide and conquer. A fourth general challenge is the appeal of the strongman message, the populist message in the current global context that we are facing. So in many countries, the isolation that emerged during the pandemic and with social media, plus economic anxiety creates this a serious longing for sense of control, certainty, and belonging, which we know has led to a rise in conspiracy beliefs, but it also means that a populist message, a polarizing populist, particularly strongman message, using a blame game, naming enemies, identifying enemies as the answer to the problem. Here is the answer to the problem you are facing, whether that's unemployment or cultural change. Here's your enemy. I will be the savior. I will be the one to defend you against it. And so those messages do address the longing, but it also adds to what we call pernicious polarization. That is the extreme polarization of us versus them, naming the enemy, dehumanizing them, and creating the perceptions of an existential threat from them. All right, so those are the common problems that we've seen around the world. Now, what do we face in the United States in addition to those? I've named 5 that I think are important to understanding what is happening now. The first is that, unlike many other countries, younger democracies emerging from various forms of authoritarianism, we have very little living memory or experience in the United States with authoritarianism, with the important exception, of course, of African Americans, Black Americans living in the Jim Crow South. A second factor to consider is the national mythos of American exceptionalism and the confidence in the strength of the Constitution and institutions can really bring about complacency and even denial that, could it happen here, is the question that people ask. A third is that the actual institutional structure that we have stemming from the Constitution locks in disproportionate representation, which facilitates the rigid binary polarization that we have. So the institutional structure I'm thinking of are the winner-take-all elections for Congress and many state legislatures, which are based on single-member districts rather than what most democracies around the world use is some form of proportional representation. You add to that our extremely strong Senate and the Electoral College that creates a bias in favor of, particularly of rural areas, and whatever party has the advantage in rural areas, then we end up with this disproportionate representation. And this, in part, has led to the United States now being uniquely polarized. Extreme instance of this pernicious polarization compared to our peers, other wealthy long-term democracies. And this inhibits the ability to resist the abuse of power, to coordinate and cooperate to resist the abuse of power. And finally, I think just, the lack of protest culture in this, very large, decentralized society that we live in. So the specific collective action problems that we've been seeing in the United States under the Trump administration, as it has attempted to concentrate power in the executive, but also to kind of bring to heel certain sectors of the economy and the civil society. The 3 that have been mentioned the most are the corporate sector, along with big law. And here, I think we might look at to understand the sources of some of this collective action problem, the shift from a stakeholder to a shareholder paradigm that occurred in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that helped to change the incentives for corporations to really focus on short-term share prices and so shortening the time horizon, focusing on the share prices and the competition among them, rather than the earlier, more cooperative nature and norm sharing among large corporations. And also a belief that assuaging the leaders' demands today will reduce bullying or further demands tomorrow. And I think we've seen that this is unlikely to succeed. Then we have our social and legacy media and how that has come under the control of mega corporations with profit motives, which affects the nature, the organization of those media. We should note that we have the potential cross-sector media empire being built by the Ellison family, an ally of the president. And then we can add the clickbait media profit model. So just the business model itself is a problem for collective action and contributes to the polarization, and the algorithms for attention driving social media bubbles and rage. So again, inhibiting collective action. And the same with the universities, how they've moved to competition for students seen as customers, the dependence on federal funding and donors, and over the years, faculty power being reduced vis-a-vis administrators and boards, and the growth of adjunct professors. So I would say on the US, time is running out. We need to be paying attention. We need to be acting, but the US is suffering from this regime uncertainty. You could see it in the Democratic Party, the indecision about how to respond, the slowness, in fact, in responding, the seeming shell-shocked nature in the first few months of the administration. You can see it among the organizations. They're not sure how to respond. And even among the citizens. Again, how do we interpret the current moment? Well, the US has been backsliding for at least a decade, and this is looking at democracy rankings like BDEM, the Varieties of Democracy Institute, but it's accelerating now in 2025. And just to compare with other countries that backslid into authoritarianism of some sort, that crossed the line, out of what generally is considered democracy. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela took just 9 months to get the constitution changed and approved by the people, and then took just 5 years to control all of the major public institutions. Viktor Orban in Hungary similarly replaced the constitution within the first year of power and continued to redistrict electoral districts to his party's advantage, which helped him continue to win elections. And it took about 10 years to the point where he now controls at least 80% of the media market. So that brings me to the question, what to do? And again, based on comparative research, I will suggest these 5 items in considering responses. The first is the need to actually recognize the real grievances that people do have. Economic, social, cultural grievances. They are real. People are feeling them, and they should not be dismissed, either by a political party striving to come to power or by other organizations, civil society and other organizations working with them. The second is that it's very important for organizations and political parties to admit past mistakes, particularly if they had been in power in the past, the parties that lost to the current Democratic backslider. Then it's important to admit past mistakes and what the party or the organization plans to do differently. And here I would include the university sector in here as well. Third, it's really important not just to say we're fighting against, a backslider, somebody who's eroding democracy, an autocrat. You've got to make positive proposals for the future. What kind, and be thinking about it and driving the agenda now, working on the proposals for reform, for renewal of democracy, for addressing inequalities, for renewing the social contract. Fourth, it's vital to broaden the coalition to build a strong democracy movement to defend it. And this is not only political parties, but it is within the broad civic sector. And so we've got to avoid purity tests and demand that everyone else come along with your particular positions on every issue before you will agree to ally with them and join this broader coalition. Instead, we need to connect on what are the fundamental shared values having to do with liberal democracy. And finally, creating community is so important. There have been so many critiques of how community has been lost, and there's a strong drive for particularly traditional kinds of community, traditional views on morals, and the feeling that morality has been hurt in recent years, that the association of communities, whether they're religious or not, has been declining. And defending democracy, we know from research, really becomes much more possible when we can rekindle the connections and a common purpose, around a common purpose, and try to empower and not, which makes it more possible to empower citizens and to feel their own agency rather than demobilizing them. A second thing to do that we are proposing in our book, Murat Somer and I, is to slice the apple differently to create a large majority for change. So we have this axis of polarization in the United States. We have these, really meaningless labels, left versus right. Those are the labels that have been attached. They're used in a derogatory way by the other side. And we've created this axis of polarization around that. We need to shift the axis, or we could think of it as the definition of the conflict. Lee Drutman's written about this recently, the strategic use of conflict and the definition of the conflict. And we need to shift that dividing line to break what we say are the prison cells of this left-right polarized binary, that people feel like they're in prison cells. And we've got to shift that so that they can break out and build new, broader coalitions. So we can create a new dividing line around fundamental values. We must not do it around blame and shame or creating a new enemies list. And this is what we call in our work transformative repolarization, proposing change and proposing reforms, but around a value that will be transformative and address many of the grievances, but by the fact of proposing change is probably going to be polarizing. So transformative repolarization, we say, is what we need, because to build a new majority, we've got to shift the line to build a new majority and to protect democracy. And the third step in there is to change the narrative. So what is the American story? What is our common purpose? What do we owe each other? So I've been playing around with ideas myself based on a lot of research that a number of organizations have been doing. What are the unifying kind of values or concepts across American society? And this is what I've come up with for the next poster that I will use for the next, opportunity. Fight for freedom and fairness. Cut out cruelty and corruption. So creating a dividing line between freedom and fairness, which is what most Americans can gather around, and rejecting cruelty and corruption, which most Americans will want to reject. This can include a number of issues under these frames for which specific proposals should be generated, but I'm thinking the freedom can address the issues of how do we thrive, health, education, housing. How do we have meaningful work? What do we do about AI? How do we have bodily autonomy? And then it's not only the freedom to, but it's also the freedom from, of course, fear, crime, intimidation, censorship. And the fairness can include representation, political representation, an equal voice in politics, equality before the law, due process, civil rights, while at the same time we want to end gratuitous cruelty, dehumanization, mass firings, and we want to end a rule of the rich, money in politics, and blatant enrichment in politics. So to conclude, I will say that agency is the key. In democracy, power comes from money and influence, or if you can build a strong majority of the vote, that's the main source of power in a democracy. But to get there, we have to empower voters and organizations to coalesce around core values and a common purpose. Then to support the kinds of structural reforms, these major fundamental reforms that we need to achieve that common purpose and to achieve the renewal of the democracy. So thank you very much. I'll put my website up here in case you wanted to see more information, and I'd be happy to hear your comments, your questions, and to enter into a discussion.
Why don't I throw out the first one then to get everything kind of rolling. You had spoken about the steps that the political parties and other groups, but political parties as well, can take in moments of democratic backsliding, and what strategies they can, what steps they can take. But watching the Democratic Party right now, they seem paralyzed. Doesn't seem like the party has a real any clear direction in terms of how to challenge this threat. And what I'm wondering is if you can tell us, based on your your knowledge and research comparatively in terms of many countries going through a moment like this, how common is that? How common is it that the major parties basically seem to be not have a direction, almost seem to be in shell shock and not responding with any clear strategy against the threat?
What we've seen is not actually so much shell shock, because I said other countries really have, a lot more recent experience of countries that are suffering this already have more recent experience with autocratic forms of government, and so they're not as surprised as I think Americans are for the reasons I said. However, what we normally see is the response is divided, and many political parties are divided because of that regime uncertainty, because it's unclear, particularly when the changes are being made, a policy is introduced to do one thing, to change something about the media sector, or to change something about the electoral law, or just to redistrict election seats where they do have single member districts. But one particular policy in itself does not threaten the democratic regime. And so people will say, well, that's, let's just stop, challenge that. But it's in our normal politics. So that's very common. But they're often divided between how far to go and how fast to go, and how much to work with negotiation with the government, with the governing party, and how much to actually, go all out and oppose them. And that's what we saw, for example, in Venezuela at the beginning with Hugo Chavez. It was really a maximalist response that much of the opposition went all out. One of the early things they did was actually to have a military coup, which failed after 2 days. But so that part is, and then they divided subsequently after they tried a number of maximalist things to remove Chavez from power rather than negotiate with him. They tried general strikes, military sit-in, a number of things, mass protests. Then they divided over whether they should just go back to electoral mobilization and win in elections, or continue the kind of more extra institutional kinds of measures. So that that part is very common, trying to decide how to respond.
So Mike, if you had a question, we can go to you. And then I have Barry Stewart Mann and Rick Donor afterwards.
So Jennifer, it seems like the regime uncertainty is a fundamental problem that we have to overcome. I mean, if we're going to implement some of the solutions that you recommend, I mean, we need to overcome that first step. And what do you see as some of the strategies we can follow for addressing that, straight on? It just seems like a ubiquitous problem.
Well, I think what a number of us are trying to do, a number of political scientists, particularly comparativists, are trying to address that by bringing lessons from abroad, showing what happened in other countries. Not only how did they backslide, what are the steps, what does it look like, so that we can recognize the early warning signs, but what kinds of resistance might work. And so that's what I think political scientists should be doing more of, And also, you know, sort of convincing media journalists about what are the early warning signs, and let's pay attention here. This can't be coverage as usual. This can't be, you know, equivalence or false equivalence of what's happening here. But of course, breaking through, the problem is to citizens, is the critical thing. And that is where we need a lot more innovation. We need a lot more, particularly within academia, I think within think tanks. I will recommend my colleague at Carnegie Endowment, Rachel Kleinfeld, and Renee DeResta wrote a fabulous piece recently that's up on the Carnegie website about the kinds of communication that we need to have now, how communication has changed, and that it's relational. It's not kind of top-down informational coming from trusted media and news sites. It is relational, and this is with the kinds of influencers, you know, the whole influencer career path, you know, but it's very different through the social media. So particularly for the younger generations, and that we've got to learn to do that, or otherwise the only people that we're publishing our op-eds for and our you know, articles are, yeah, a small bubble of people ourselves. We're not reaching citizens, and we're not reaching young people.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thinking about your last slide, I think it was the what to do slide, and you had one column that talked about kind of meaningless binaries, you know, the way things are opposed to each other, and the notion of reframing the narrative. And I'm thinking in this kind of what often seems absurdist political theater, specifically of the term woke. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about what we do, or how that exists in the world that we live in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that term, you know, in particular, has really been transformed, you know, over the years from its origins, and been, you know, weaponized, to use another term that's become, you know, of age. But these binary, you know, we were saying, most political scientists were saying, you know, the U.S. is divided along partisan lines, and it's Republican, you know, Democrat, and it's become extremely polarized around that, as partisanship has become a social identity. So there are a number of political scientists, Iyengar, you know, Lily Mason, others who have really expanded on this, how it becomes a social identity, and this is what creates this in-group, out-group kind of conflict, and this perception of the other as a threat. So what I was saying is, yeah, it's not even so much partisan anymore, though. It's not so much the identity with the Republican or the Democratic Party, which is fine, you know, to identify with them, but it's this using them as denigrating labels. And the whole left-right, which is ridiculous in reality, because most people have complex combination of positions on issues. There's not a straight left, you know, group of issues and right group of issues in which people agree on the whole thing. So in that sense, it's meaningless. And what people even mean by left and right, we've seen this around the world. Left and right, what political scientists were using, that old scale, from a unidimensional scale to measure differences on issues, and it's just one dimension that we had said was from liberal to conservative or left to right, it doesn't apply anymore. And it certainly is not just on the economy, which it used to be. It's on cultural issues, on religious issues, on a number of different things. So in that sense, it's meaningless as well.
Rick Donner?
Two questions, Jane. One is, you haven't mentioned unions and their weakness and their potential role. So please speak to that. The second issue that I've seen discussed a fair amount is a proposal to have some sort of shadow cabinet on the part of Democrats. Because what we see, it seems to me, is there certainly are plenty of Democrats speaking up, but there's no real focal point. And if attention is now the currency of our politics, Democrats are not getting it. And so one proposal is that there be a shadow cabinet in which individual Democrats be responsible for responding to whatever the administration might be doing or in another country and other administrations doing. So what do you think of those two issues? Thanks.
First, unions is critical. And of course, unions have been so weakened in this country. But that combines with the problem of political parties being less rooted in the society, what we used to call the anchoring in society. So, it's a combined problem. But the strengthening civic associations, such as unions, combined with the political parties needing to do the work of getting out, mobilizing, not relying on expensive ad campaigns that aren't reaching a lot of people anyway, but getting out, mobilizing, organizing, the field work kinds of things, and being better anchored in the societies and with other organizations. So it could be with unions. And the reason I think I would say unions on their own is because part of what I see is that we've gotten way out of whack is the relationship between capitalism and democracy. And of course, they're intertwined, they're interdependent in so many ways, but we need a balance. And right now, it seems that capitalism is winning because we have very little capacity to regulate and to rein in the extreme income and wealth inequality, the lack of social mobility, and the mega corporate mergers that we're seeing. So unions, lacking, debilitating workers' strength through unions is, I think, a part of that, big part of that.
Chip Carey?
Hi.
Oh, I'm sorry, Chip, before you go, I'm sorry, the second question, I forgot the second question. Let me answer that. The shadow cabinet. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I've been talking to people about that too. Of course, this makes sense in a parliamentary system where you have a party that has people ready to go, the actual shadow cabinet for the different positions, the different departments or ministries. And in the United States, the Democratic Party has a real problem, I think, in several ways. One, of course, it tries to be a big tent. So it tries not to impose, a single message. It doesn't impose much discipline on the party because it's a big tent party and there are so many different, issues and groups represented. So that makes it difficult, particularly when it's out of power and there's no clear leader. So other countries, do have a clear, so if you just look at Turkey today, when they replaced the president of the main opposition party, the CHP, you had the main candidate, who is Imamoglu, who is now in prison, but you have the main candidate, but then you have the party president who was elected to replace the last one. Of course, the Democratic Party, elects a chair, but Kid Martin, how many people know the name at all? Whereas in a country like Turkey, the president of the party, the chair of the party, is separate from the political leader who might be, and can play a more major role. And so now when you have the Democrats, first of all, they can't agree, and the only leadership we really have are in the Congress and the Senate. And they're divided there. They have been divided about how to respond. They're finally getting agreement now on the shutdown. It's like the first thing we've seen them agree on and really fight on. So there's more agreement now, but still a difference as you see other leaders. I think it's healthy that other leaders are speaking out, the governors in particular, other members of Congress are going around trying different strategies, trying different communication strategies as well. I think that's healthy, but I think it's just a structural problem in the US, but particularly for the Democratic Party as a big tent party. And for either party, when they're out of power, there's no clear leader. So a shadow cabinet is a very interesting idea, I think, for the Democrats to consider, so that they have somebody who can go out and carry messages on different issues around the country. If, of course, they could agree on what they want that message to be, because I'm not sure they have yet an agreement since they haven't had to form a new platform, say for the next election, that's going to be the issue. But if they could, then I think that would be helpful. Now, Chip, sorry.
Sure. Thank you. This is great. My overall question will go to what was the transitions literature of the 80s and 90s? How much, to what extent is it analogous to today, given that also today includes a really exceptional case, or at least a relatively unique case, the US, which is consolidated democracy deconsolidating into something, competitive authoritarian regime, or maybe a liberal democracy. And reasonable people would disagree where we are in that transition. But in the 80s and so forth, the transitions literature argued for strategic actor models. And they kind of assume more consolidated authoritarian regimes that were liberalizing. So Stepan and Lenz would argue for societal conquest after a period of liberalization. What I think your research question is more, how do we liberalize our regime by constructive or non-polarizing resistance in a democratic context, as opposed to societal conquest, which usually involve more of these things that you alluded to briefly, like a kind of civil society coup against an authoritarian regime. And even John Kerry called the Egyptian coup, I recall 15 years ago, a democratic coup. I consider, well, we won't go that way. But, so my question is really, are you trying to work within the system, and are we at a stage of liberalization of a deliberalizing, deconsolidating democratic regime? And is that a different strategy from a long period of resistance and a slow but steady period of liberalization, which involves societal conquests, often with crowds, confronting the dictator, and then there's a split in the regime where the military doesn't go save their leader because they side with the people, or some other lots of scenarios. So I guess what I'm saying then is the transitions literature appropriate now for not just the US, but primarily the US, but also equivalent regimes that are more consolidated democracies, but they're not like Duterte in the Philippines, or something where that even the strategic actors really were not writing about those cases. That was more a case of elections. If you get a foreign monitored election and you can throw them out just with an election without liberalization, or with minor liberalization of the regime, but not the long protracted Brazil, Argentina, and just, yeah. I hope my question's clear.
Yeah. So for those who aren't political scientists, this is, talking about how political scientists were trying to analyze countries, especially in Latin America, Southern Europe, that were moving from, that were in authoritarianism, is either a military dictatorship or a personalist dictatorship like Franco in Spain. How do you break that? How can you move back? How can you make a transition back to democracy? And there's one really major difference that's important, and that is that everyone knew what they were in. They knew they were in dictatorship of some form. There was not this regime uncertainty. So by political regime, I'm talking about the political system. What's the nature of it? Is it a dictatorship? Is it a democracy? Is it a liberal democracy, which has separation of powers, which protects individual rights? That's the liberal aspect of democracy. So back then they knew what they were in. The uncertainty about the change did come about a bit as those systems started to open up a bit, what you're calling liberalizing, opening up a bit, and then they didn't know how far it would go. And so if you think back to Gorbachev, even when he, was trying perestroika and starting the opening and glasnost, he didn't think it was going to, undermine his government completely. So there was some uncertainty, that's correct. But they knew where they were, and what they could focus on is trying to split the government or the regime, those in power, to split them, to get defectors who would negotiate with the opposition, what we call the softliners, negotiate a transition to address problems that were happening, so usually there was economic problems, security problems, there were some problems they needed to address. And so the difference today is really this regime uncertainty. We don't know, which goes back to Bernie's first question. People aren't sure even what is the intention of the current government in any society, or in this society. What is the intention? What's the end goal? We know a lot of people are studying the different factions within it. There are different intentions, and there's Christian nationalism and Catholic integralism and tech various words,
Billionaires.
tech feudalism, various words for that. But economic populism of Steve Bannon, and those are in some ways competing. And so, we don't know even within those different ideologies, what's the end game, what is Trump's end game in his mind. So motivation, intent, that's really hard to discern, or within those competing factions, which one might win out within that. And we also don't know what might be the unintended consequences. So regardless of their intention, what are the unintended consequences? And this creates a real problem. I think it creates almost extra problems for us today, particularly to get the collective action.
Thank you. Emily?
Fantastic talk, Jennifer. Thank you. I wonder, when I'm hearing your sort of construct regime uncertainty, I was just thinking about kind of, I don't know, drilling down into that to look at the mechanism, and thinking about the literature on high risk collective action. And it seems to me that the uncertainty, at least in the American context now, from all the activists and politicians I'm talking to, is that it's two types of uncertainty. It's uncertainty about the regime we're in and where we're headed, like basically how bad is it if I ignore this? And then the second thing is uncertainty about what's going to happen to me if I stand up. Right? Like this problem of stochastic political terror, the problem of getting doxxed or ending up on a watch list. There's a lot of uncertainty. Some people are like, oh, this is basically just a time for everyone to stand up and call their bluff. This isn't an authoritarian regime. Yeah, nothing's going to happen to me if I stand up. We can't let them intimidate us. And other people are like, no, we're going to get stopped at the airport. If we try to leave the country, we're going to end up with death threats for our children. So the mechanism there, it seems to me, is like kind of the expected costs of inaction versus the expected costs of action. Like, if I don't think I'm in a regime that's headed toward authoritarianism, the costs of inaction are low, because this is just going to sort itself out in 2026 without my sticking my neck out. But then the costs of action are whether or not I'm going to get hurt, or my children are going to get hurt, or my career is going to be affected if I stand up. So like those are kind of twin parameters, right, that seem like it shapes the expected costs of collective action. I just wonder if both of those are what you have in mind when you think about regime uncertainty, or if you were thinking more just the first.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Good to hear from you. There are a number in the literature, and going back to the transitions literature as well, there's a number of different kinds of uncertainty. And so there's informational uncertainty, and you don't know, you don't have full information, or you don't know which information to believe. So particularly information about if there's a black box, if it's a military regime or something, really informational uncertainty. There's strategic uncertainty about where the process is maybe going, the intention, the motivational and intention and strategic aims. There's uncertainty about the power balance or the capacity of both sides, but particularly what's the capacity of the regime. And then there's uncertainty about, that gets at sort of the second of your uncertainties, the personal consequences. There's, what I've seen is a lot of uncertainty about the willingness of any particular leader or government to use repression. And here's where, if we look at the compare Venezuela and Nicaragua of the last decade, when those two governments have been willing to resort to force and extreme repression in countries that had been, especially Venezuela, that had been democratic, that had a culture of democracy, has been shocking. in order to avoid being ousted from power. And there's different reasons for why they are so worried about being ousted from power. I mean, the US, you can see clearly, we're blowing up boats off the coast of Venezuela. So for that case, they're worried about leaving power because a number of them are under indictment by the International Criminal Court or by the United States, et cetera. So, you know, there are reasons they are. But how much, but as any individual citizen will wonder, that personal insecurity, I think, is crucial that you're talking about. What are the consequences if I do speak out? For us as professors, you know, what, and you know, you and I have talked about this. What are the consequences about writing, publishing op-eds, speaking out, being critical when we know of a government who doesn't like criticism? Going to protests, going to No Kings this weekend. We'll see if people are worried. And of course, going out protecting immigrants when, you know, ICE patrols are around the streets, trying to protect or trying to even just, you know, watch and film and monitor what's happening. What are the consequences? So I think you're absolutely right. That's a critical part of it. And it's sort of what it is uncertainty about not only what is the capacity of the government, what is their tolerance for using a repressive kind of response. And just to go back to the Venezuela example, like I saw when Hugo Chavez was alive and in power, electoral legitimacy was extremely important to him, and international legitimacy. He wanted to win elections and to win them, you know, in a convincing enough manner that people would, you know, think that he actually won. And he usually did win, you know, at least 56 to 64% of the vote. He won repeatedly. Nicolas Maduro, his successor, without all of the resources that he had, that Chavez had, was willing to resort to actual repression when he couldn't win in competitive elections. And so part of it is the person, you know, trying to really assess the personal tolerance of a leader for and their own perception about what's important. What kind of legitimacy do they care about? Who do they care about it from? And then what are the resources that they have if they want to carry out retribution or, you know, suppression of dissent in some way? And so those are all part of uncertainty. But the regime uncertainty specifically we're talking about is not knowing at any given moment what is the context that we're in now. Are we sliding down? Are we in this hybrid, you know, partially democratic, partially authoritarian? Are we, you know, where are we going? And what's it all going to add up to? All the individual policies, what's it going to add up to?
Mike Evans. Yeah.
So Jennifer, you know, there are two reasons why I don't sleep very well these days. Is one is staring at this authoritarian, you know, it used to be slow moving, now kind of fast moving autocratization that's taking place. But the other is trying to keep up with what's happening with artificial intelligence. And I texted you about this yesterday because, man, maybe it's because I see it as, first and foremost, just a threat to higher education, to, you know, to education in general. You know, we're seeing it, but also because, I mean, when you look at the massive investments that are being made, the move being made right now around artificial intelligence is to make it too big to fail. With these you know, according to the Wall Street Journal this week, you know, if OpenAI fails in these investments, you know, it could crash the world economy. Like, they're making themselves trying to set things up to where we have this structural dependence on just going all in on unchecked AI development, which, according to, you know, just about every expert, you know, is creating an, you know, unacceptable existential threat to human freedom and flourishing, to human security, not, you know, to our ability to our livelihoods, you know, and I see that and I've noticed that Bernie Sanders came out, started talking about it this week, but also some people that I associate with just cultural conservatism on social media have started speaking out about it. I see this sort of emerging bipartisan, possibly bipartisan, the beginnings of maybe this sense that we really need to do something, and we need something fast, just like we need to do something fast about democracy, about liberal democracy. It seems that we have a narrow window to do anything about artificial intelligence, unchecked artificial intelligence. And I wonder if first of all, I don't know, we have the luxury to wait on artificial intelligence, and maybe it's something we need to, and we need to prioritize it as a policy issue, period, and stop. But maybe it could be something that we repolarize around. So that's just, and I don't know exactly how, but it's, one thought, and this is, an old idea, and a really old idea about the fragility of republics going all the way back to antiquity, right? Is that they need some sort of external enemy to hold them together. That polarization or factional violence, results often as a result after an external threat is removed, right? And I've been thinking, they're talking about artificial intelligence as a new alien creature that is going to, could it be an external threat that we use to bind, as a common enemy, to unite? Not, we can't universally unite around it, but maybe we could create some new coalitions around that, and somehow tie that also into defending liberal democracy. And I'm not saying I have know how we do those things, but it sure seems we have to be doing both these things at once. Because I think they're both really urgent.
I think that's very interesting, Mike. And I just want to say to Christina, I see your question in the chat, so I'll come to that next. Could AI be the bipartisan issue that, that repolarizes, that we could, a new dividing line that we could make, or just a unifying thing as an external threat? I think, I think there's some reasons that that's going to be very difficult, but like social media, that we've seen a lot of bipartisan consensus growing on the harms of social media to young people. That seems to have been growing, and it is bipartisan, both within states and in Congress. So, that kind of gives a hopeful sign for this. But for AI, I think the biggest problem is that you've got, and this is part of the real conflicts within the administration, you've got this within Silicon Valley, you've got the types that want complete liberty and have an actual, a strong confidence in the ability of technology to be the savior of humanity and technology to address our needs, but that to do it, they must have liberty to do it and to develop it, and they cannot be constrained. So Peter Thiel has been making this, very strong argument about that, even calling, any kind of regulation and talk about protection of the safety of AI as the Antichrist. I mean,
Right.
Some amazing lectures he's been giving. So you have that kind of view, and then you have a few in Silicon Valley who are still willing to talk about the dangers of unfettered, unregulated, fast development of AI without thinking about the consequences and doing something about that. So the question is whether the problem is that, the tech billionaires are so influential within this administration, but within the same administration, you've got a Steve Bannon who's very concerned about it,
right,
and losing jobs and stuff because of AI. So, it's really again, it all kind of coalesces. What's Trump's mind? What do how does this coalesce? How does he deal with all of these things? So yeah, I think there's the potential to draw that as a coalescing, broad coalition, kind of a new line of polarization. Let's deal with this. We've got to deal with this. I think there's a potential, but I think there's these constraints that I was mentioning that are going to make it difficult, but not, but still worth trying, because there's so many interests to be addressing. So, yeah, and Emily writes in the chat, yeah, the AI threats to families, children, and workers is a big opportunity for common ground across the left and the right. So, I think it's worth trying, but it's going to be fighting against some of that really big money and those ideas, and then some of them, the very extreme ideas, who want, those who follow Curtis Yarvin, who want a CEO monarch, who want, basically another new form of autocracy. So I would just want to answer Christina's question. She says, what role could or should political scientists play in helping parties actualize these recommendations? And, here I have debates with political scientists because I am a member of SSN, and we think, we should be public scholars and publicly engaged. I personally think that political scientists, are really, really good at focusing on causes and diagnosing problems, but are often reluctant to consider solutions and thinking that's too prescriptive. That's policy or that's political theory. But of course, looking at solutions, there is an evidence basis for assessing evaluating what kinds of solutions will work. And so, of course, we're trying to do that within comparative politics, looking at this question. But I think we have an obligation to our society to engage and to talk about these things in terms of helping parties actualize these recommendations. One of the things I didn't put in the talk, but I think is really critical, is we need a division of labor, because so many things have to happen at once, just what you were talking about, Mike. We have to be developing proposals for reform, for restructuring, for, addressing these big problems. We need proposals. Who comes up with the proposals? Well, intellectuals, think tanks, universities, academics. We come up with proposals. We come up with the ideas based on our research and our experience. Who is going to advocate for change? You have who's going to try to move the Overton window, who's going to try to move public opinion and broaden what may be possible to get a majority on. Well, that could be the activists. That could be, the people that are considered the extremist even, but really trying to change public opinion to be, more open to certain, rights of certain groups or certain kinds of change. Who's in charge of building majorities, coalitions? Political parties, politicians. They've got to look at what's possible now, not what the future Overton window might be, but what's possible now. And then you've got, your everyday citizen, and then you've got everybody else, influencers, cultural leaders, faith leaders, artists who can bring a different thing on them, and then all of your corporate sectors that have to step up to defend democracy. So there's a division of labor. And so I think political scientists could be helping to with recommendations on proposals for what's worked in other countries, what are innovative new ideas to deal with these now. How might we restructure our electoral system? How might we restructure our economy in different ways? New forms of unions given the new form of economy, new models for media, for business, all of these kinds of things, new communication models. And so we can put the proposals out there, and then other groups, the advocates, the civil society groups, organizers and political parties, can then try to mobilize public opinion around them to get them going. But I think we should be helping and putting proposals out there.
I'm so glad we got to that question. That was a wonderful answer. Bernie, we just have a few minutes. Why don't you close us out here?
Okay, I guess then one last question. So in your talk, you had talked about how that Americans, one of the issues is that they don't have a living memory or experience of authoritarianism. And I'm wondering if while I can certainly see what you're saying, and it's a very strong point, if there's also an opposite side. And I just want to know your opinion as an expert in this. There is also, I mean, if you look at the Hungarian case as just one, I mean, what I've seen there is that there's, you know, they have very short periods of democracy, and otherwise it's been in a country living in authoritarianism for what, forever, basically. And it seems almost like there is an acceptance that happens there, that they grumble amongst themselves, but they give in. And I'm wondering, and again, this gets back to Chip's question, and you had made the point that, well, you know, people had actually used to know if they were in a dictatorship, and this is what competitive authoritarianism, the whole point is to hide it and disguise it. But it seems to me if Donald Trump is going to stay in power for the long term, at some point he has to take steps that start becoming really obvious, right? Because he can't stay president for a third term without obviously violating the US Constitution. If he runs for election or another Republican and they lose the vote, let's say in Arizona, but the state legislature decides, doesn't matter, we're giving our electors to the Republican candidate anyway, and he wins, which obviously is just completely undermining democracy. This becomes something that becomes more obvious to a public that doesn't know what the unitary executive theory is, you know, doesn't understand how the executive branch works, but does understand some of these very basic concepts. So I'm wondering if at some level, at least in the US, there is the opening for you know, this type of a resistance. At least I wonder what your thought is about this.
Well, I want to say, and I want to, you know, qualify what you said that I said, which was accurate, that we don't have living memory, with the really important exception of the Jim Crow South and of Black Americans living in that, and and so the memory and when people have a recent memory, you know, have lived, you know, a personal experiential memory, they are often unwilling to go back, and you know, as they should be. So that is, I think, that is one thing. Now, on the other hand, the post-communist cases may be different. One, there can be a lot of nostalgia for the past as well, and even for dictatorships or communist leadership, because of safety and perceived stability. Safety and stability are really important to people. So there can actually be nostalgia for dictatorial periods of various kinds. So we have that to deal with as well. And the third issue is that in a country like Hungary, that's a very legalistic erasure of liberal freedoms in the country. It's legalistic. There's no repression. Human rights aren't being abused. People aren't thrown in jail. It's really more of a legalized corruption. Then when you go there, as you know, you go that you don't know you're in autocracy. It's, you know, it seems fine. You go as a tourist, it's great, you know, and even the people there, they're only constrained in certain ways, and they are constrained. Professors are constrained in what they can teach. They can't teach women's studies, gender studies, immigration studies. And, you know, there are different kinds of constraints. So that makes it also hard when you're talking about building a movement. Yet, even in Hungary, they've had major mass protests. And just recently, they've had them on different issues, on education protecting, on protecting Central European University when it was being pushed out of the country by the administration. More recently, when the government was going to cancel the Pride Parade, there was a mass turnout for the parade, to attend the parade. And so, you know, protest. So it's interesting to see what it is that will drive people to act.
Okay, we are at time, but I want to thank, first of all, Jennifer McCoy for an excellent presentation, and all of you for a wonderful discussion. And a big thank you to Bernie Tamas and Mike Evans for putting together this wonderful series. We'll be back again in 4 weeks. Mike, did you just want to say a bit about next Max Talk?
Quick, and I think, you know, we wanted Jennifer to kind of tee us up and, kind of give us the big picture view. And, I think one of the things that she talked about and that came out of the discussion is we have this epistemic crisis. We have a problem of polarized trust in sources, in media sources, in our in institutions that we rely on for telling us the truth about factual reality, and it can make it, and I think that can exacerbate this collective action problem. It can make it harder to sell the public on what our real threats are. And so we're going to look at this through the lens, in particular, of the recent attacks on our public health institutions coming from this administration. But we've invited Frances Lee to come from Princeton. She and Stephen Macedo just published a book that's gotten a lot of attention because it was highly critical of the policy response, pretty critical of those institutions that we rely on for telling the truth. And they did it, from the perspective of liberal Democrats who understand how vitally important those institutions are, and trying to offer a critique that that will hopefully lead towards them improving, but doing so in a climate when they were well aware that we also have a trust problem, and do they run the risk of further exacerbating the low level of trust that people have in these institutions. And so they received quite a bit of criticism for the book and for their arguments. And so Frances graciously agreed to come and talk about the book. And we have two people from CDC who will be speaking. They're also somewhat sympathetic to our arguments, but Michael St. Louis and Daniel Pollock and our very own SSN's very own Rick Donor will be moderating what I think is going to be a really great discussion.